let's start this debate and let's invite the Prime Minister. Yeah.
Right. Can I be heard? Do I need to wait for stream to set up or anything?
Green Newton, can you confirm?
Okay, steady.
Newton is all good. Cool. Green Newton said good. So, Prime Minister, you have the floor, or the virtual space, whatever.
All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the problem in this debate is that Neuralink technology gives unprecedented degree of control of individuals to computers, to corporations that use these computer interfaces, etc. And I think there's 2 reasons. The first is that the interface inherently allows in people to apps to directly access your brain and to like in the same way that because you use the computer, in the same way that when you use a computer, they directly feed information. As this time goes directly to the neural pathways of your brain. In that way, we suggest that because of this, you fundamentally cannot consent, and this causes disproportionate societal harm, which we suggest is sufficient to ban the development of this. I'll take any clarifications about like this Neuralink tech at 1 minute, since there was some confusion. And we're going to prove 2 things, therefore. First, why we think you structurally cannot consent to either being part of Neuralink research or Neuralink like technology, or using Neuralink technology at the point that it's like common. Second, I think I want to prove why this massively drives up inequality. But before that,
neurotropic drugs provided direct access to the brain through drugs. Is this somehow different specifically because it's electrical impulse, or is there another reason why Neuralink is specific?
I mean, unless my understanding of computer is very wrong, the drug cannot be used to directly fuck with your brain, right? But a computer can. I think there's a clear distinction. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Right. So on consent, the first thing I want to prove is that insofar as the research process is concerned, this is something that you cannot consent to. And I think the frame that you need to recognize first and foremost is that we ban unethical research all the time. Like we would not allow you to forcibly hold someone underwater to see how long he lasts before he dies. And the reason for that is because we recognize 2 things. 1, we recognize that there's an inability to consent fully to things that we would broadly agree are just fundamentally undignifying or fundamentally wrong for any individual to ever have to go through. And therefore, we suggest that we need to protect individuals from themselves at a point that they may make such decisions. But secondly, we recognize that more often than not, you just don't know what is going to happen to you fully at the point that the trial happens, because there's a significant degree of uncertainty in the status quo. And that's why we will ban you from having incredibly invasive medical treatment without proper care before that, for example. Finally, I think there's just some bars that we never want to cross in terms of the things we are willing to do to other human beings, or the extent to which we are willing to trade off other human beings in order to claim somehow majoritarian progress. Why do we think this fits these particular criteria? The first thing I want to note is that in the research process, you are fundamentally never able to consent, because part of the research process is about knowing what happens and the way in which Neuralink is going to affect the human brain. The difference with doing it on a pig, however, and animal testing, is that unlike biology, but like the rest of our biology where organs are similar, the unique thing about humans and what distinguishes us from animals more often than not is the ability to have definitive sentient thought and a significantly greater understanding of knowledge and conscious thought that exists between humans and animals. And that means that brain work is uniquely distinct when it's done on animals versus done on humans, which means that individuals have the minimal ability to consent. But secondly, I also think that society just doesn't have the basis to determine the moral acceptability of these policies, because we just don't know to a much greater degree the implications of this work directly on neural pathways that influence individuals of the brain. And to that degree, we think that these inherent research processes are things that we should reject. But secondly, I also think that even beyond the research process, this is just unacceptable. And the first thing I want to prove here is why the use of this technology is fundamentally going to hurt agency. I think we need to note the difference between this and anything else that influences your decisions. We would ban you in the status quo from holding a gun to someone's head and forcing them to make a particular decision, because in that situation, we think that there is already no reasonable way for you to say no when you're weighing up the 2 options that you have in front of you. The difference in Neuralink is that even the basic process by which individuals can sometimes decide that they would rather die than live and take on the impossible choice, even the way in which they make these decisions is fundamentally broken in the status quo. There leaves you no ability to make this choice. In other words, we think that this is even worse than the greatest degree of loss of agency that exists in the status quo, because it ruins your ability to make any conscious, rational decision that you can claim to be your own on that side of the house. Why do we think that this is something that is worth banning on our side? Right? I think there's two things. The first thing I want to note is that we think in the status quo that that you cannot consent to losing all future consent in the first place. The reason for this is and this is why, for example, we ban you from doing things like slavery and suicide. And the reason for that is two things. One, we recognize that future choices matter, and that you as an individual now are different from your future self, and that the state is an imperative to protect, one, your future self, but two, your ability to make choices that might be different from the ones that you make now in the future. And for those reasons, we think that we have an obligation to protect this degree of future consent. The second thing to note is that we think that as individuals, because you can never rationally understand what the future is going to be for you, you can never make an informed decision to give up your future consent, which is why we think that therefore there's an obligation to protect you from making these decisions in the status quo. But the second thing I want to note is that we think regulation is just impossible, and that also warrants a ban. We think it's impossible because of the degree of regulation creep and lobbying that is likely to happen on that side of the house, because there's an incredibly high ability for you to convince people that there are things within the Neuralink that they might potentially want. For example, the perception of higher productivity, or the perception that you have higher creativity. And because of this and the way in which groups like the corporate lobbies, for example, are likely to force these on individuals in order to get more productivity out of their workers, there's an inherent incentive for you to just keep on biting at the existing regulations that exist, as we see with environmental regulations today. But the second important thing to note is that it's incredibly likely that this development will go faster than our ability to regulate it. Because what lobbying does is that it blocks your ability to create new regulation, even as it tries to bite away at existing ones, one. But two, because it often requires a lot more in-depth study of what's happening with this development before you're actually able to make decisions on how to regulate. And the problem is that in this time, development continues at a lightning speed. The implication of this is that we are never going to actually be able to control this, and therefore, in other words, you seek control of literal human agency, and who developers who may not necessarily have an incentive that is aligned with the individual. For that reason, there's no way to protect any degree of individual agency on that side of the house. Insofar as you're dealing with something that you potentially can never control, we think that there is a legitimate reason to ensure that it is banned. But secondly, on this idea of inequality, I want to note that either on ops side, they give everybody this, they try to make this accessible to everyone, in which case you, one, have maximum lack of consent, but two, you also have a maximum hurt for the poorest who can't access this, or you limit the supply to maximally unequal areas. The problem is, I think that the ability to access such a significant differentiating factor limits the basis of equal opportunity on which society is created. It limits the claim that every individual has equal access or equal potential access to the public halls of power or public spaces and conceptions of success within society. To that degree, we suggest that it breaks the fundamental principles of equality that society is based on. And for those reasons, we think it is legitimate to ban such development that we cannot control, and is likely to screw up things like agency and consent for individuals in the long term. That's why we will propose.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to move on to the leader of the opposition now. Here.
Okay. Here, give me one real quick second. Let me just adjust the
No
Zoom.
problem.
Yeah. Okay, I got the chat open for everybody, so I'll be able to see as soon as you put up that POI. Because yeah, that'll be good. Okay. If the panel is ready, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So I think the first. I'm very glad that I can finally use my engineering degree in a debate sphere, because this almost never happens. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is to push back against the OGs fiating this idea that what we're talking about is some supercomputer that is going to like enslave the mind of an individual. And because the point at which the current technology exists now is so heinous, we are so close to this doomsday scenario that we must ban this outright, that we cannot allow any sort of like structural or legitimate institution investment and research within this. So I think, first of all, let's characterize who we're talking about and who Neuralink, because this is in the motion, specifically wants to help, right? The point of these is to help with amputees, to help with people who are physically disabled, people who are mentally disabled, people with things of certain neurotropic illnesses like epilepsy. These are all the specific targets. Nowhere in Neuralink Charter and any other company that is specifically developing these technologies currently does it talk about reading and writing images or thoughts into someone else's brain. Sure, we'll contend with the idea that this potentially could happen in the future later on in my speech, but at best, we are like literally decades away from this type of technology. Like the amount of technology we're talking about is orders and orders of magnitudes much greater. And I think at the end of the day, this takes out a lot of like kind of OG's framing and characterization that they then build into points with their principal matter here. They talk about how like you can't consent to anything that takes away future consent. Yeah, sure, we agree, but that's not what Neuralink is, and there's no reason why the banning of it now will solve for this. They also talk about how you cannot consent to research, at which point, like, you don't know what will definitely happen. Well, we would say most research, you don't actually know what will happen, especially with human trials, given that it is research. And even when you kind of like know, you're pretty sure there's some margin of error. And second of all, we note that like, I'm going to give you a really explicit principled pushback on why the rights of the disabled and the rights of the people currently suffering are ensure that we must pursue this like rational level of development and that anything else can go through. But first of all, I think like what we need to talk about is gov burdens, because we don't really get that specifically. We think there's two gov burdens that it's kind of not dealt with. First of all, the gov burden to prove that the tech won't be developed in an unregulated way. I think there's a huge assumption that if you ban it from legitimate institutions somehow, because no other medical thing happens in the world where like bad actors still develop it, even though it's banned in the Western world. And secondly, why Neuralink should not be developed, given that we already developed medicine that is potentially dangerous when there is a large enough harm. Okay, neither of those things are addressed at all. I'm very interested to hear what DPM has to say. First point of constructive though, there's an undeniable need and benefit from a health standpoint to continue this research. How does Neuralink work? Okay, it helps in a very limited way to try and solve some very specific maladies that I've already given you, right? The populations that need it are some of the most vulnerable in status quo. This is the disabled, this is the amputees, this is people with epilepsy and other neurodegenerative conditions. These groups often have physical impairments that lock them out of traditional work, and there's a certain physical dependence on others that also breeds a certain lack of dignity, right? So we notice that like people who suffer from a lot of the conditions that Neuralink is trying to solve not only suffer from like physical impairments, but also from like a certain level of being locked out of the society in the status quo. We note that current solutions are all half measures or don't solve it in any way. We think it's completely non-solvent in the status quo for any disabled person, anybody with a spinal cord injury or anybody who lacks, feeling in their toes. But for epilepsy patients, like example, medication often comes with severe side effects and they're very expensive and over a course of like a very long time. So what are the impacts then of developing a technology that can provide another mechanism of solvency or one in which nothing else exists? So we think firstly on the price, there's a one-time cost versus a continual throughout the lifetime for a person of drugs. And specifically that as Neuralink gets better, the price of these types of devices will decrease. Second of all, there's a harm reduction. We have a higher potential of total solvency in our world compared to literally zero in the gov world for a lot of these conditions that they completely fail to address. But we also think generally like there's like a certain level of dignity about no longer being tethered to like the sort of specific medication that you must take and you must always have access to over a finite time span. Like we note that Neuralink is specific because it's like a single fix to a lot of these conditions that otherwise take a long and continual process. We also think there's more autonomy to the individual because there's a lack of then suffering. And then also we think there's a dignity also stemming from this type of idea of autonomy and again of unshackling yourself from any specific like long-term like drug regimen or any sort of like other health thing that you almost always have to be even confined to a wheelchair. We think does innumerable help like goodness to a person's autonomy and dignity. Let's deal with their like doomsday case and like why we want big government research or big corporation research. We think the best idea is that we are decades away from the doomsday scenario, as I've already told you. But we notice that if you have legit institutions developing this, especially when government funding, you have a couple of key things that we think are unaddressed. First of all, you have a clarity of the process. You have the public is constantly updated. There's an ability to enact controls and regulations throughout development. We disagree with OG when they say there's no ability, considering every other medicine that we do, no matter how quickly it's developing, we literally enact controls on the process. And the studies are well regulated ethically. If you ban it, you are banning it from legit institutions only. Because there is such a massive market incentive due to the insolvent nature of a lot of illnesses and maladies that we've already talked about, there are other actors will work to create this or some version of it, but I think CG disagrees.
Does the government effectively and efficiently regulate emerging technologies in the status quo?
we think no, of course, it's not like always perfectly like efficient or done, but we think in general, like most emergent technologies, specifically with medicine, are often well regulated and are often done well, especially when we're talking about the West. But in general, and also like you don't see people just dropping dead of their like bipolar medication because like this was new or something like that. Okay, so what do we notice then from this bad actors thing? We think bad actors monopolize the market, and it gets worse because now if legit actors were ever to try and enter this market in the future, they're way behind. And also, if governments try to like regulate this in the future from a bad actor standpoint, they fundamentally don't understand this technology. Therefore, they can't enact the rules and regulation that are best suited to this type of thing. Finally, legit actors are the best because these are the only way to ensure global ethics standards generally being adhered to. And sure, maybe we're not perfect if CG wants to say that, but I'd say on the comparative is certainly better than non-legit actors. Finally, my third point of character construction, right? Governments knowing a technology could help millions can't principally ban it out of the unsubstantiated fear, especially out of yet OG. Okay, at the point at which I have already told you, the doomsday scenario they're talking about is 50 years away at least, right? We see this, that it is principally unethical to do this thing. And we see this paralleled with the development of cancer treatments, right? Like a lot of cancer treatments are very dangerous. But at the point at which we do allow research, because the malady they are facing is so horrible and so dehumanizing, we think this principle extends to something like Neuralink. I've already told you why all the maladies are specifically insolvent within the status quo. There is no existing mechanism or other mechanism being currently developed to solve for these. And the things they are facing are so terribly and so horrible and dehumanizing to people that yes, we do allow this thing. And at the point at which they can't show current concrete harms for the research that we are doing, we think this does square with our medical principles and currently how the status quo works very effectively.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'm happy to welcome Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, nice. So I don't have an engineering degree. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some educated guesses in my speech. The first thing that I want to talk about is who exactly this technology has been developed to help and what the opportunities are for the future potential of this particular technology. Presumably, if this affects epilepsy patients or people with neurodegenerative diseases, as much as we sympathize with the plight of these individuals, we must also understand that these are the vast minority of individuals that exist in the world today. What this therefore suggests is that for such a groundbreaking and revolutionary technology like Neuralink, the significant capital that has to be sucked into the development of these trials and these forms of information for us to generate better outcomes in terms of this particular technology cannot be paid off from just the market that is this group of people. So what we can reasonably expect from the end of this then is that the companies that are involved in terms of creating Neuralink don't intend to stop there, and in fact are very likely to be using this particular stage as a testing ground, both for willing human like people who would like willingly go and try this thing, but secondly as well, in order to ensure and to buy in greater legitimacy for their company's brand for something that's potentially a very dangerous technology. And here's where we want to talk about the actor that is involved in this particular scenario. Because I think opening opposition in terms of painting why the private or unregulated market is a bad actor undercuts their own risks about how the doomsday scenario is very far away. And the reason for that is because we assume that if it is true that we are afraid of an unregulated market, then we must similarly recognize that the unregulated market can probably create bad outcomes very, very soon. But secondly, an unregulated market is not really something to be afraid of, given that it doesn't allow for the proliferation of this technology, obviously, in the same way that you could in a governmentally approved and sanctioned method. So I don't think that that's a comparative harm. It is one that exists for banning any sort of treatment, and is one that we can just further clamp down on. And the start from the government ought to be as such. The second thing that I want to talk about is why we think that this is a thing that we already recognize that governments ban. The first thing to note is that the way that technology develops often does not cohere with your expectation of the timeline through which technology should develop. The reason for that is because of arguments like singularity and the like, which is to say that you are uncertain at any point when you are going to make the next big breakthrough that, like, what's that word? Like hugely increases the speed at which you can garner new technology. I know there's a word for that, but I can't remember what it is at the moment. But basically, huge breakthroughs massively increase the speed through which you are able to generate new breakthroughs in the future as well. And this is crucial when it comes to things like Neuralink, which cannot just be about helping individuals who are currently in a position where they need these kinds of mental health. Because the notion of a computer to human body interface suggests that this has some sort of effect on the cognitive capacity of the individuals who are involved in this as well. And given that that is the input required to generate greater advances in this technology, we think you can't actually reasonably, or at least with certainty, say that the doomsday scenario is 50 years from now. So that's the first big thing that we need to talk about. So given that to be the case, and given that you have no certainty of to what extent problematic outcomes might come about from this technology, then we need to talk about when governments impose regulations. And the first thing we need to note is that these regulations are imposed when we cannot conceptualize of how exactly this technology might go out of hand and how exactly or what exactly the repercussions of this particular technology are. So obviously this is an incredibly gray area. So let's attempt to make it a bit clearer as to why Neuralink falls on the side of having to be regulated and banned. The first thing is that we think Neuralink talks about an implication on the mind and agency, but also in terms of creating capabilities that are epistemically inaccessible for any stretch of the imagination, which is to say, our ability to send electrical impulses into the brain of an individual to be able to control what goes on in what is a largely unknown organ is something that individuals cannot even reasonably assess in terms of what happens in the outcomes. This is distinct from cancer treatments because cancer treatments affect the physical body, which may well, yes, be deteriorative and transformative, but is different from assessing and changing the part of your brain, that is, the part of your body that is literally the one that is responsible for the generation of that consent. Therefore, the capacity to consent into these specific laws of agency does not exist because there's no meaningful way for the state to be able to conceptualize the harms that might come out for you. Therefore, given that the state can neither predict with certainty what happens to this technology, and secondly, cannot actually understand the implications that this might have for an individual, we think this means the standard from when states should err on the side of caution to ban this particular technology. Yes, OO.
Can OG give us any guarantee that bad actors won't develop this technology regardless of what they choose, given that this is what happens with most medical treatments that are efficacious, they are developed like in parallel with bad actors?
Like, so I presumably if you ban them, then like, I don't know, like where are they going to find their labs? We can like kind of like shut them down. We ban the sale of these things. Like this is just a hugely different and new kind of technology. Presumably if you ban that development, you will never allow them to patent this technology. You will never allow them to sell that on the market. Like the scale of the people that it reaches is just very different. Like that's just why governments ban things in general, right? So I don't see what a humongous trade-off is. But the next thing is there's a huge trade-off and risk that comes from the lack of certainty. And the reason for that is because of regulatory creep. So even if it is 50 years into the future, the creeping changes that exist in between is precisely what we are afraid of. So even if it was true that this is a length of time that we need to accept, which we don't necessarily think that it is, we argue that lobbying works even worse in these scenarios. Because if we can recognize that the doomsday scenario might exist, then we argue that regulations will never work. And the reason for that is because one, you are literally introducing this particular technology in a scenario in which you are saying that it is necessary to help people who have never been able to be helped before. We would argue that the same amount of money being sunk into the development of this technology can be used to create better and more effective drugs for this exact same group of people and make it cheaper as well. But secondly, a lot of the time when technology advances, the issue becomes regulatory creep, which is to say that you can increasingly lobby governments towards allowing for more and more accesses of what your technology can do, and paint it as benefits for individuals. And therefore, this disregards the ability of the government to ever be able to step in at any point to draw the line and say that this is where the technology has become too dangerous and must stop. So even if it was a long period of time, there's no capacity for the government to be able to guarantee with certainty that they're able to eschew the worst harms of this particular technology. On the counterfactual, banning the technology completely, particularly at this particular point when we don't have the understanding of what exactly goes into the kind of processes that we're talking about, is exactly what we think the government should do at this point. It's the only responsible decision, and it's significantly easier for them to uphold against lobbying. We're happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Happy to welcome Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Okay, give me 1 second to set up the timer.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, awesome. I'll just put your POI in the chat. I'll get to it in the middle of my speech. So my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. So I don't have an engineering degree either, and my partner fed me this entire case. So my speech is probably just going to center on why Gov failed to fulfill their burdens and why all the harms enumeration in their case is really not unique to their world, but rather just depends on how this technology pans out and whether or not we decide to ban it or regulate it, and how principally and pragmatically we win this debate on ops side, because it is the right side of history, essentially. Okay, so what are the gov burden in this case? We believe the gov burdens is to fulfill two things. To fulfill First, to prove why just because of the ban, the technology won't get developed in an unregulated way. Because if we can prove that the technology will be developed in an unregulated way by bad and antagonistic actors, we basically get all of their harms that still that they claim only exist in our world still exist in their world. Secondly, is that they have to prove to us principally why Neuralink is so unique as a technology that even though we regulate a lot of other tech that is dangerous so people can use it, we must ban Neuralink. Like, what is Gov's uniqueness essentially in today's debate? Okay, so what does my partner tell you? My partner tell you that we give you a characterization that there is a market incentive for people for corporation, government, or non-state actors, bad actors, to develop this technology. We tell you that it is to fix spinal cord injuries, mental illness, epilepsy, etc., any neurologically generated problems. We tell you that there's an undeniable need and benefits from a physiological and psychological standpoint, where a lot of populations needed some of the most vulnerable in status quo, like the disabled, veterans who got hurt, people with epilepsy, etc. Right? And we tell you the current market solution simply does not solve for it, which we do not hear a pushback from Gov side, so I assume they agree. And then I would also add on to that there's a lot of other research that is funded by, say, Neuralink that is useful outside of just this idea of the brain interfaces, namely robotics, neuroscience, surgical instruments, etc. So we tell you there's a massive pragmatic benefits and a market push to develop this technology. Why is this so crucial in today's debate? We tell you then legitimate institutions studying this and developing this is the best case scenario, because this means that we're probably going to have overall more ethical process of development and process of pushing out this technology than in any other case. But then this also means that we have time to regulate this technology. OG tries to tell us that lobbying and regulation is frankly impossible because no corporations will want to have less productive workers, because Neuralink probably guarantees more productive workers. Other than the fact that they don't really understand this technology and doesn't tell us why that is definitely the case, we tell you that during the process of development, legitimate institutions will constantly update the technology to the public, just like how we know about Neuralink now. The public then can act as a check on the process. Legitimate actors can engage in ethical process of development more, and democratic institutions and other legitimate government actors can pass regulations on the technology. There will probably also be global initiative to regulate the technology, and that therefore can be facilitated in an ethical and equal way. We have time to establish regulation, and here's the thing: even if they don't buy our 50-year span, banning it, which probably means you're not going to study the technology in the first place, we still have a more of a time frame and possibly opportunity to study the technology and regulate it. Here's the thing: under their world, there's no guarantee that bad actors won't do this. Other than my partners, like an overall example of how bad actors can still do this and monopolize the market, let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you ban the technology in one country, which probably means that other countries will end up taking the advantage of the technology. What does this look like? Let's say US or UK bans this because of the ethical concern, or all things GovSci wants to tell us. Countries like China or non-state actors probably will still take advantage of it. For example, stem cell research is largely done in other parts of the world because the US is not willing to engage it in as much. What is the impact of this? If the technology gets developed by antagonistic actors, people in places where this technology is banned are then disadvantaged. Since there is no way that gov side can prove that people won't seek out this technology since it exists, people try to buy the technology from other bad actors or antagonistic actors. Let's say Americans travel to China to get this technology and then return to the US. Due to the lack of home regulations in development, Americans are now subjugated to Chinese technology that is developed and regulated through Chinese law, which is usually lax. Since the home country does not have the ability to regulate the specifics of the technology or doesn't even have the understanding to do so, the citizens of these countries are heavily disadvantaged. They're less protected because the legitimate actors they have cannot protect them. Another impact under this is if we accept OG's idea that everyone in every government in the world bans it, every world government bans it, and that corporate and government interests extend beyond to help people who are disabled, but also to other objectives like maybe military use, we can then assume that bad actors will use this in the same way. Let's say legitimate government banned all of this, right? We will argue it is actually all the more important for legitimate actors to have this technology to fight back. So even if we buy your characterization that there are other objectives than just to help people, we still think it is important for world government to have it. Before, if CG has a POI, I'll take it. Okay, no, so OG.
What makes us?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
What makes it likely that a technology in which the powerful actors are also the individuals who have regulatory capacities are likely to be regulating this technology well?
Okay. Here's the thing, even if we buy your worst case, which is America regulates it or UK regulates it extremely badly, we still think it is better for them to have this technology and they have an incentive to protect their citizens or else regimes will crumble in this case. We don't think we need to defend nation states' ability to protect its citizens, right? In that case, we still think it is better for them to regulate it in the worst case that they will than not have it at all and be taken advantage by non-state actors who might use this in a really terrible way. Okay, principally, we believe it is wrong for a government to ban a technology simply on the basis of it is dangerous. When the market demand for it is so strong, it can help millions of people, especially when there is existing mechanism to either regulate it, facilitate healthy development, and existing status quo technology that is dangerous but still being used to help people with heavy regulation. We tell you that Neuralink, although looks daunting today, isn't that unique in the human history of pursuing new technology to make our lives better. For example, chemotherapy used to be thought as painful and dangerous. We still use it, right? Even though it is quite a dangerous technology, now it is less dangerous and we still use it. To the point at which there are a lot of technology that once is dangerous or still is dangerous, we don't think principally gov side establish uniquity. And we think to the point at which they do that, we win this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to now welcome the member of government here.
All right, everyone can hear me just fine?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, in that case, I'm going to begin. The key thing that top half has missed so far is analysis on why Neuralink as a technology, if and when it succeeds, will be a massive advantage to those who have it. But not only that, it's not an advantage in the same way cancer treatment or life-saving treatment is an advantage. It's an advantage in the way that the more exclusive it is, the fewer people who have it, the more of an advantage it is to those who don't. And it is this exclusionary effect, this incentive to keep out most people from ever accessing it, that we say will skew the regulatory process at both the testing and implementation phase to cause widespread social harm. OO chose to be naive and say that just because these companies haven't caused harm now, that they won't in the future. That is not systemic analysis. Right now, they're at the nascent stage. There's no potential for harm yet, but we say you need to stop them before they have the potential to cause harm. Furthermore, we're going to prove to you how governments and profit-driven corporations are uniquely bad actors at regulating nascent technology that stands to make them a lot of money and give them unprecedented political control over the minds of their citizens. Before that, just a bit of comparison with OG. I think OG is out of this debate because because their main argument about Neuralink was that it's uncertain and therefore it has to be banned. But this doesn't deal with the main offense about why we don't just ban uncertain things like vaccines. Our answer that CG uniquely is going to provide is that we don't ban things that have the potential to bring collective good, but Neuralink will almost certainly bring about widespread inequality in an unprecedented way. Before I move on to our two arguments about first, how this is bad and exploitative at both the development and post-development phase, and second, about how this leads to widespread global inequality, a bit of response to the Deputy Leader of Opposition. First, I think OO failed to explain why the benefits like solving epilepsy and so on outweigh the harms, and why existing treatments for those things are insufficient. It's not clear to me why people have a principled right to be superhuman as opposed just to a right to be cured, and Neuralink is kind of like a superhuman giving technology. Second, on their black market argument, first, I just want to say that they can't just fiat that this ban will only take place in the US. I think that we can agree that it could possibly happen worldwide. I mean, that's not really an argument or rebuttal for this thing. But second, even if it only is banned in one country, Neuralink is the kind of thing that you can't easily sell in the black market without it being pretty obvious that you're doing that. Unlike a liver or cocaine, it becomes pretty obvious when you're the only individual who has this technology to upload your brain into a computer and suddenly are processing things at superhuman speeds. Suddenly China has Neuralink. Everyone's going to suspect maybe Neuralink sold it to China. And I don't think a company would want to risk losing their medical license in that way. But we're going to prove to you why, even if the black market develops, the ban minimizes the worst harms of the technology. And I'll be moving here to our case. First, about exploitation at development and post-development phase. First, about development, we agree that maybe it's some years until this actually goes to market, but we see that the testing and medical process, in the vast majority of countries, even the most developed ones like the United States, have historically exploited the poor and unemployed, people desperate for a buck. The reasons why regulation for the testing phase are inherently bad are couple-fold, right? First, that it plays the most desperate individuals who are desperate for the money that you get from being a test subject and who have the least to lose by subjecting themselves to an invasive and unknown treatment. Second, regulators don't actually know what to regulate since the technology is nascent, and all the more so with a new technology. Here we're applying OG's analysis about how it's uncertain to show you why it actually makes an impact. And third, governments don't have an incentive to regulate things if it's going to block the development of technology that brings about a lot of social good, especially in the case of Neuralink, when governments' incentives will be such that when governments realize that they can stand to benefit massively from this technology, they're more likely want to under-regulate the process so that the technology speeds up as fast as possible so that the government can benefit from it in the future. Think of military governments, think of law enforcement and how much they would see the potential of having a technology that allows you to process data at a much faster speed, that allows you to potentially read the minds and thoughts of people. I get that that's not a Neuralink's thing now, but the point is the technology, the capacity to see that, to have that happen. And if the government sees that capacity will benefit them, they'll not want to under-regulate this. Now, we don't just ban things when the medical testing is dangerous. Like we don't ban vaccine testing, for instance, but I think we should uniquely ban Neuralink testing because unlike cancer treatment, the benefits are not concentrated only to the sick. They also can extend to healthy, wealthy, powerful politicians, the precise people writing the regulations, which is why those people in that situation have perverse incentive to under-regulate where they don't in most other cases of life-saving treatment. Furthermore, I want to point out that corporations have a great incentive. Oh, I also want to point out one more thing. The government doesn't have the electoral incentive to regulate on the behalf of the test subjects because they are a minority. They're probably just going to be a few hundred people. Moreover, they're probably going to be the poorest, most unemployed, most vulnerable people, the ones who are most desperate and willing to subject to themselves to medical experimentation. Time and time again in the United States, African Americans have been used for gynecological testing, for testing for a cure for syphilis and tetanus. Do you know how many hundreds of people died as a result of that? We don't want that to happen again, especially in the situation where we said there's uniquely bad incentives for the government to not want to regulate it. But furthermore, the people who have the Neuralink technology, the corporations, actually get a massive boost by its existence. This technology creates an asymmetry that can't be overcome by government regulations because the people who have the technology can use it to circumvent those regulations. For instance, how do you regulate scientists who have the capacity to upload the contents of their brain onto a computer chip? They probably have ways of circumventing the regulations and continuing to develop technology in a way that you don't. Maybe they'll develop it in like a cloud computer that they offload their brains into and like set a machine to like develop it instead. The point is that we ought to regulate it now to minimize the harm. As time is of the essence here, the more you allow them to develop it, the more the capacity they have to escape the regulations develops. Before I continue, let's take a POI from opening if they have one.
other than the fact that we talked about world government banning this and not just one country, I guess CG didn't flow well. Our point is, regardless of the current treatment, individuals will seek out the technology from bad actors. Legitimate actors' inability to understand it or regulate the technology takes away the only protective mechanism to help these individuals. Also, notice banning is not regulated.
I think you have 15 seconds. Sure, at least when we ban it, you cannot legally sell to African Americans and other poor individuals vulnerable to medical experimentation. That they have to agree to it, right? At least they lose a legal mechanism for carrying out harmful development and testing phase. The second thing also is that any amount of a ban reduces the amount of inequality that would develop as a result of this technology going to market. So even if this technology develops far into the future, it still matters. That's why we pursue nuclear disarmament and fighting climate change, because we still think future harms matter and if we are certain enough. And I think it's pretty certain that this technology, if it goes to market, will be reserved for the few, because it's the kind of technology where if you have it, you don't want other people to have it, unlike cancer treatment, right? Where it doesn't matter if someone else has it, because your advantage in having it is by being the only person who has that capacity to like have a superhuman computer in your brain, right? And so you're going to block regulations like not having a price ceiling, not having limitations on privacy, and like having access to your thoughts. And what this means is they're likely to redefine what it means to be human in favor of the most powerful and most dangerous individuals. How would you ever be able to compete fairly with the wealthy and powerful when they have access to a supercomputer for a brain? We think that that's reason enough to ban this technology we're so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'm very happy to move on to the member of opposition here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, just turning on my timer. Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do two things in this speech. I'll first break the deadlock in opening and explain why regulations are actually effective, which will be a far more persuasive response than the uncomparative stuff you get in O as to why, oh no, black markets will make it anyways. But I'll secondly talk about and further exploit this weakness of our opening and not just focus the benefits solely around those privileged persons with disabilities, but how it's generally beneficial and why it will actually trickle down to more than the rich in the long run, which will also crucially just engage with any of the harms CG wanted to talk about. Firstly, why do we actually get like regulation and we don't get that sort of abuse these guys want to talk about? I would like to note, like, I don't really buy OG's mechanisms here or corporate lobbying, which is kind of like what CG deliberately extended on. I like to note a few things. Firstly, insofar as like there might be 1 or 2 or 3 companies producing it right now, but those are likely to increase in the future insofar as there's a significant market demand for this. Crucially speaking, this means that competition will exist, and that competition necessarily means that like different companies will be trying to point out flaws with the other company's sort of products. So if one company tries to manipulate your brain, if they wish to or collect data, it's something that can be pointed out by the marketing teams of the other corporations trying to shit on the other corporations, which means even though the government will not be able to regulate, corporations themselves can regulate. But secondly, even if there's just one Elon Musk that's developing BCI, I like to know there exists competition for investment funds from other technology producing companies that are not producing BCI. Insofar as they wish to perhaps show or point out any valid concerns or issues with the BCI testing processes or its actual production in its product in itself, they're likely to point that out in a way to like drive down the investment for like Elon Musk company and say, hey, look, this is a shitty as fuck technology. We're going to use all of our marketing power to show the world that it's actually collecting data or doing all sorts of fucked up things so that investment in
Is it just me? Sorry, we can't hear you.
Your mic is disconnected. Oh, okay. Sorry. I can hear you now. Can you hear me now? All right. So where did I leave off?
My timer just continued. Liam, did you stop your timer at the same time? Yeah, can you just tell him what time?
1 minute 50, and the last thing that was on the timer is the competition with other medical firms and investment banks.
All right. I'll continue from there. Continuing in 3, 2, 1. So even if there aren't like firms that are competing on BCI technology, there are firms that are not just medical firms, but other sorts of firms producing various other sorts of technology, they don't wish for like BSET technology to succeed, so they have interest to point out any valid issues that could exist in either the product or the testing phase. So to pay people who have actually gone through processes to testify, to use their marketing campaigns and use their media, like lots of PR budgets, to actually talk about how this technology is somehow collecting data or anything of that sort. This crucially means that there exists a deterrence, not just from the government, from other competition, BCI firms and non-BCI firms, to actually ensure that like these companies don't go rogue and start collecting data or start manipulating the way your brain works, either right now or in the long run. Crucially, this competition on other corporations exists simply because like they wish to like, you know, have investment into their different sort of technologies insofar as they see valid problems with the current form of technology. If the firm is going rogue, you know, they're likely to be able to point it out. But lastly, I mean, GovBench does assume a certain amount of political capital to be able to shut down this technology. It's like the baby, which is something that firms have already invested a lot in. So presumably we don't debate it in a context where corporations are so powerful you can't do anything to them. Insofar as you can ban it, you can presumably regulate it to some extent as well. But more analysis here, 3 more reasons as to why regulation can work. A, I like to note like regulation can exist and can be understood. There exist things like technocrats and so on. And in crucially, there's a popular incentive for regulation converse to what CG says. This is because currently data collection, like discourse and interest has peaked, especially with the outbursts of the Cambridge Analytica scandals and things of that sort, have been widely tapped upon by people, by politicians, by activists wishing to raise discourse on it. Which means crucially right now, people do have a popular incentive to ensure technology by 2 things that you note. Firstly, there's a conservative bias that exists around like even things like good technology like vaccines and so on. And there's also a technophobic bias in so as you're conservative, lots of people are old, they don't hear like new technology. So you need all the more reasons to ensure it works fucking properly. And governments have all the more reasons to ensure that they regulate it, presumably, especially in the long run. But secondly, I like to note this is not like other forms of technology. Regulation is likely to be accepted here because the main way to make profit is to sell off this technology, not just to like the person with disabilities, but to other people as well. Like as opposed to that, the ways technology hasn't worked in terms of Facebook and so on is because like Facebook literally benefits off data collection. On their side, they don't really have any benefit or any exclusive incentive structures to ensure that they continue to perpetuate these problems with technology and collect data or manipulate your mind. I'm unsure as to why that works. It just limits the effectiveness of the product. So you have an other like superior profit-making mechanism, so you're likely to accept these technologies as opposed to risk being banned. But also crucially, like if your market, at least in the short run, is like rich consumers and so on, insofar as you're exposed, they simply won't like fear this and won't buy it. So there's a demand incentive to ensure that technology doesn't do fucked up shit as fucked up as government bench tries to talk about. CD comes and says, thank you, that, oh, you'll exploit them in like the testing phase. I think one, it's symmetric. Like lots of people in any sort of testing phase get exploited by money and so on. We recognize that as a harm, but that never outweighs the broader consequential benefit. That moral doesn't outweigh the broader consequential benefit in any sort of vaccine technology or literally like anything of that sort. So I'm unsure why that should matter here to ban it. But secondly, I just like to note all the analysis I provide as to why generally the products like to be good also applies even more in the testing phase, because that's where the easiest time where your license could get rejected. So all the competing firms, all the competition, all the other corporations that perhaps have an incentive to point out any legitimate flaws will all happen here as well. Notice this is crucially important. Not only is much better than what opening opposition runs in terms of counter to this, but it tackles on both government metrics to explaining why the benefits of this technology are actually likely to accrue, not the harms that they try to talk about. Crucially, trivially speaking, also like health experts, technological experts have pretty stable jobs. Regulations already exist, boards exist. I'm just unsure why they're all suddenly going to be flipped. It's simply because of some sort of lobbying power. The second thing I would like to note here is like in terms of affordability, going beyond what opening opposition talked about, there's likely to be widespread application. One, insofar as demand exists, there's likely to increase supply in the long run simply because more firms want to produce it, so there's more competition and more people jumping on the bandwagon. This especially is true, one, because like BCI as a technology overall cannot be patented. It's a very broad form of technology, so other competing users are likely to happen, but also patents just expire in the next 20 years. So I think in the next 100, we can still reap the long-term benefits. The second reason why this is important is because costs also is likely to go down, which increase the ability of you to reduce price in the long run. This is because you can have things like feasibility studies, you can have things like more research into it, more expert, but insofar as profitable and people want to have it, you're likely to have more investment, which means the capacity to reduce costs and hence reduce price exists. The incentive to remain competitive also exists. And I wanted to note further, like the market incentive demand like also exists, because you might sell it to like rich people, person with disabilities in the short run, but then who do you sell it to after if it's really a one-time technology? Which means you have to lower costs and have to expand to other markets. Maybe not the poor, but things like, like lower middle class families, upper middle class families. All of this means it's a large enough benefit. Crucially, note public health systems are also likely to include it, and NGOs can also rally donations to have one particular chip installed in a person who's suffering from disabilities here. I like to note thus, this broadens the benefits. O talks about the benefits, but this explains why they're so broad and why they're so important. Not just to like cures and things, but also like not just to specifically those people, but it also ensures that you like to have cures for certain types of diseases, because you can now understand what patients with Alzheimer's truly feel, how their medical processes works, and all of this is important information to having cures for this type of stuff. All of this is crucially important because we not only we prove why those benefits like to happen in the long run. Oh, I'm sorry, time-related issues. For all those reasons, opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'm happy to move on to the government web here.